Hey groupers, Pastor Marshall. Hope that you're ready to continue our study of the book of Acts. We're in Acts chapter 11. We're going to start at verse 1. This last week I broke the ice, and I want you to break the ice by sharing a little bit of stories. Have you ever had a time in your life when you believed that God was directing you and you weren't sure that everybody else was going to be as excited about the direction that God was sending you? Maybe it was your spouse, maybe it was your kids, maybe it was your church, maybe it was your friends. I shared with you on Sunday about when I believe God called me to the ministry, and I was worried that my mom and my dad, they had other visions for my life. I can also remember when I was in seminary, and when I was in seminary, a lot of my seminary work was breaking down what I believed to the core so that I would understand my beliefs and their basis. But in that breaking down process, Claudia had a lot of questions about what was happening in my life, about the direction that my life was going. I wonder about you. Do you have a time that God convinced you to go in a certain direction, and then there were blowback, or you were at least worried about telling? Maybe there wasn't blowback, but in your heart you thought there was going to be blowback when you shared it with somebody. Well, in verse 1, Luke mentions the circumcised believers. That's the phrase that the NIV uses, that criticized Peter. So first thing, maybe you remember from my message this last weekend, but who are these folks? Who are these folks that are criticizing Peter? Who are these circumcised believers? And then it appears to me that the circumcised believers criticized Peter publicly in front of the church. What do you think of that? They had a criticism, they had a concern, a disagreement, and they criticized Peter in front of the church. What do you think about that? How do you think, what is the best way? Because we're going to have disagreements in the church. We're going to sometimes come to things that misdirections or misunderstandings. What's the best way for us to handle those kinds of conflicts? This is our church boardroom. Certainly are conflicts that happen in the church, and sometimes they happen in our boardrooms. Not that much, to be perfectly honest with you. But how are those things best to be handled? Well, next, Peter shares 4 successive revelations that God uses to convince Peter that Gentiles are now going to be a part of the kingdom of God. What are those 4 revelations? What are the 4 things that God does to bring about this area of conviction? And then Jesus declared that all things were clean. Jesus said we can eat bacon. Now you got to turn to Mark chapter 7, verses 17, 18, and 19. I'd like you to do that. I'd like you to look it up. I'd like you to read it. And then I'd like you to talk about, what do you think about that? Do you think that we're allowed to eat anything? Maybe not everything is good for us to eat, but do you think that we're allowed to eat anything? That God doesn't look down at us if we eat something? Is there anything on your list? Well, some folks think that Peter is actually quoting Ezekiel here. And so I want you to look it up. It's in Ezekiel chapter 4. And I'd like you just to start in verse 1 and read this prophecy. It's a pretty long passage. Definitely get through verse 14. That's where the quote's going to come from. And just read it. Ezekiel is being told by God about the siege of Jerusalem. And there's some interesting things that God has Ezekiel do to communicate to the nation of Israel what was going to happen in the siege of Jerusalem. But then specifically, besides, I want you to answer, what did God ask Ezekiel to do? But then specifically, what was it about food that caused Ezekiel to say no to God? Peter says no to God. And what was it that Ezekiel said no to God about? What do you think that, and do you think that Peter is quoting Ezekiel? There's some conversation about that. Well, every week we just talk about what we like and what we don't like. I love that this story ends in unity and praise. That's the way that conflicts, misunderstandings, disagreements, that's the way that they ought to always end in the church. They ought to end in unity and praise. What do I not like? Well, I'm not a big fan of legalists. These circumcised believers were being legalistic. I'm not a big fan of that. And then finally, application. I challenged you this last weekend to think about an area of conflict in our church. And what are you going to do to stop it, to stop feeding it? Maybe it's an area of conflict that you're not a part of. Maybe it's an area of conflict that you are a part of. I'm challenging you to think about, what are you going to do to stop feeding that conflict or ignoring that conflict? And what can you do to bring it to a place of unity and praise? It starts, of course, by listening. At least the Jerusalem leaders listened to Peter, and the end result was unity and praise. Well, I hope this was a great study, and I look forward to seeing you next weekend as we continue our journey through Acts. God bless.